They invited her to the party, only to have someone to sit and receive the insults. They said her father died in disgrace, that he left nothing but shame, that she should be grateful they even gave her a seat at the end of the table. But there was one man who didn't smile, didn't drink, didn't say a word, and in his hand, an old silver ring bearing her father's name. That ring wasn't a memento. It was the key to a truth that could destroy an entire family. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching, so I know how far this story has progressed. Watch until the end. You won't want to miss anything. The banquet table was long enough to seat 30 people comfortably, and that was exactly the problem. Elena Ashcroft counted the chairs the way she always counted things when she was trying not to feel anything, methodically, starting from the head of the table where her Uncle Rowan sat in his ivory dinner jacket, working her way down past the crystal wine glasses and the flickering candelabras and the faces of cousins she had not seen in 3 years, all the way to the far end where a single place card bore her name in handwriting that was clearly an afterthought. The card was slightly crooked. Nobody had bothered to fix it. She straightened it herself when she sat down. The Ashcroft estate sat on the edge of Harrow Bay, a wedge of inherited waterfront property that had been in the family for 4 generations, the kind of place that looked like money even when the money was questionable. Tonight the main hall had been opened up and strung with warm lights that caught the crystal and threw gold across the ceiling. A catering crew in black uniforms moved between the tables with quiet efficiency. Someone had ordered flowers, white orchids, Elena noticed, her mother's favorite, which felt like a cruelty that might have been accidental, but probably wasn't. The occasion was the announcement of Marcus Ashcroft's appointment as managing director of Ashcroft Capital Holdings, a position that everyone in the room had apparently known about for weeks except Elena, who had received her invitation by email 3 days ago with a subject line that read, "Family Gathering. Your presence requested." Not, "We'd love to have you." Not even, "Please come." Requested. Like a summons. She had almost deleted it. She still wasn't sure why she hadn't. Marcus was 29, 2 years older than Elena, and he had the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no. He moved through the room like he owned it, which technically he would soon, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with a smile that showed all his teeth. He was good-looking in the sharp, unremarkable way that photographs well. Elena had grown up beside him. Summer holidays, school breaks, the brief chaotic months after her mother died when Rowan had taken Elena in with the apparent intention of teaching her what charity felt like from the wrong side of it. And she had never once seen Marcus be genuinely kind to anyone who couldn't do something for him. He hadn't acknowledged her arrival. She hadn't expected him to. The appetizers came and went. Elena ate because she had not eaten since morning, and the drive from her apartment across the city had taken 2 hours in traffic. She drank water and watched the room fill with the particular kind of noise that money makes when it gets comfortable. Loud, overlapping, self-congratulatory. Rowan's business partners. Marcus's friends from the investment firm. A few elderly relatives Elena barely recognized. Women in expensive jewelry who had known her mother and looked at Elena with an expression she could never quite decode. Something between pity and relief that their own daughters had turned out differently. She was on her second glass of water when Rowan stood up. He was a large man, Rowan Ashcroft, the kind of large that had been muscle once and settled into something heavier. He had her father's nose, Gavin's nose, which Elena had always found quietly unbearable. He raised his glass and the room quieted with the trained obedience of people who understood where their interests lay. 22 years ago, Rowan began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had given many speeches. My brother made a decision that could have destroyed this family. Elena's hand went still on the table. Gavin Ashcroft was a man of... Rowan paused as if searching for the right word, and in that pause, Elena heard the entire shape of what was coming. Limited vision. He walked away from his share of this company when it was worth almost nothing and chose instead to spend his life under cars in a garage he never owned, chasing a version of integrity that frankly only exists in movies. Polite laughter. A few too many people laughed for it to be accidental. The point, Rowan continued, is that poor decisions have consequences, and those consequences tend to fall on the people who make them. Gavin made his choice. He died with nothing to his name. And tonight we celebrate the fact that Marcus, he turned toward his son, glass raised, chose differently. The applause was immediate and full-throated. Elena did not move. She was focusing on a particular orchid near the center of the table, its white petals slightly browned at the edges, trying to keep her breathing even and her face neutral. She had grown up in this family long enough to know that any visible reaction would be used against her. Tears would be weakness. Anger would be instability. Silence was the only armor she had that they hadn't figured out how to strip away yet. "To Marcus," Rowan said. "To Marcus," the room echoed. Elena lifted her water glass a half-second too late, which nobody noticed because nobody was looking at her. She set it down again and looked up, and that was when she saw him. He was seated at a secondary table along the east wall, slightly apart from the main gathering, and the fact that she hadn't noticed him before struck her as strange because he was not the kind of man you failed to notice. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been arranged by years into something careful and still. His suit was black and perfectly fitted in the way that Italian tailoring is fitted, not for display, but for precision. He had a wine glass in front of him that he had not touched. He was watching Rowan with the focused, measuring attention of someone taking inventory. Not hostile, not exactly, but not neutral either. Elena looked away before he could catch her looking. The dinner continued. The first course gave way to the second. Conversations rose and fell around her, and she participated in none of them. A cousin whose name she couldn't remember leaned across the table at one point and said something about how it was sweet that she still came to these things, which was not a compliment regardless of how it sounded. Elena smiled without showing her teeth and said nothing. It was during the third course that Marcus drifted to her end of the table. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down uninvited, bringing his wine glass with him, and leaned back in the studied casual posture of someone who had never had to ask permission for anything. "You look uncomfortable," he said. "I'm fine." "You've barely spoken to anyone." "I don't have much to say." Marcus swirled his wine. "Dad didn't mean anything by the Gavin comments. You know how he gets when he's making a point." "I know exactly how he gets. It's just—" Marcus looked at her sideways. "You coming tonight? What were you expecting?" Elena turned to look at him directly for the first time. "An invitation." "You got an invitation?" "I got a summons. There's a difference." She kept her voice even. "What did you actually want, Marcus? Why am I here?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she saw something move behind his eyes that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. "Dad thought it would look bad if you weren't here. Family occasion." "You're still family." "That's the nicest thing Rowan has said about me in 10 years, and he didn't even say it." Marcus's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile on a different person. "You're difficult, Elena. You've always been difficult." "I'm my father's daughter." "Yeah." He stood up, taking his wine with him. "That's kind of the problem, isn't it?" He walked away without looking back, and Elena turned her attention to the tablecloth and breathed through the particular pain that only family can inflict, because only family knows exactly where to press. She was going to leave. She had decided that much by the time dessert appeared. Small, elaborate things on white plates that she didn't touch. She would stay another 20 minutes, long enough not to create a scene by leaving during Rowan's next speech, and then she would collect her coat from the entrance hall and drive back across the city to the apartment that smelled like paint and old radiators and belonged entirely to her. She was calculating the timing when a shadow fell across her peripheral vision, and she looked up expecting a waiter. It was the man in the black suit. Up close, he was different. The stillness she had noticed from across the room was even more pronounced in person, the quality of someone who moved through spaces without disturbing them, which struck her as an odd thing to notice, but she noticed it anyway. His eyes were dark and steady, and they were looking at her with an attention that was not threatening, but was absolutely direct. The kind of look that didn't ask permission. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. He had a faint accent she couldn't immediately place. Not strong enough to be foreign, but not quite American either. Elena looked up at him. "I don't know you." "No." He didn't seem troubled by this. "I knew your father." The dessert fork she had been holding made a small sound against the plate.
My name is Damien Vescari, he said. I've been waiting some time to speak with you. The name meant nothing to her. She searched it quickly in the back of her mind. A business contact of Rowan's? One of Marcus's investment firm people? And came up empty. You could have called. I couldn't, actually. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew something small and held it out to her. I think this belongs to you. It was a ring, silver, weathered to the particular dull gray of metal that has been handled for years, worn down at the edges. Simple band, no stones. She picked it up because her hands moved before her mind could stop them, and she turned it over, and on the inside of the band, engraved in small capital letters that had softened slightly with age, Gavin. The room around her went distant, the noise, the lights, the clink of glasses, and the voices. All of it receded to something like the sound of a television left on in another room. Where did you get this? She said.
It wasn't quite a question. Her voice came out flat and strange. He gave it to me. Damien pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, which she would have objected to under any other circumstances. 22 years ago. He asked me to hold on to it until the time was right. The time was right. She was still looking at the ring. He's been dead for 4 years. I know. You waited 4 years. I waited until I was certain you were ready to hear it. His eyes moved briefly toward the head of the table where Rowan was now engaged in animated conversation with a man in a gray suit. And until tonight gave me the right opening. Elena closed her hand around the ring. The metal was slightly warm from his pocket, and she hated that. Hated that the first time she had held something of her father's in years was this moment, in this room, in front of these people. You said you knew him. Gavin saved my life, Damien said simply. She looked at him then, really looked. Whatever she had been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. There was a warehouse fire in the Dockside district, he said. 22 years ago this past March. He paused the first time he had paused, involved in something I had no business being involved in at that age. The building went up faster than anyone expected. I was trapped in a loading bay on the second floor. Your father was doing a repair job on a delivery truck on the ground level. He came back in. He didn't have to. He never mentioned it. He wouldn't have. Something moved briefly across Damien's face. Not quite a smile, but something that carried the memory of one. That was the kind of man he was. The chairs around them were slowly emptying as the dessert course ended and people began moving toward the bar area near the windows. Elena was aware of this without being part of it. She was aware of the ring in her hand and the specific ache that had started somewhere behind her sternum, and the fact that Damien Vescari was watching her with a patience that felt almost deliberate, like he was giving her the exact amount of time she needed. What's the ring for? She said. It's a key, Damien said. Literally. She looked at him. Your father spent several years documenting something that he knew he couldn't expose directly. The power in this family was not balanced in his favor, and he understood that. So instead he built a case. Very carefully, very quietly. Damien's voice remained level, unhurried, each word placed with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a speech too many times for it to sound rehearsed anymore. Financial records, legal documents, ownership transfers, evidence of an arrangement that diverted significant Ashcroft family assets into a series of holding companies and shell corporations that have been quietly controlled by members of this family for over 2 decades. Elena felt something cold moving through her. What kind of members? Damien's eyes moved again toward Rowan. He didn't say anything. She followed his gaze. Rowan was laughing at something, head thrown back, the laugh of a man who believed himself to be beyond consequence. Beside him, Marcus raised his glass. No, Elena said. I'm afraid so. You're telling me my father found evidence that Rowan stole from him? Yes. Damien's voice hadn't changed. From your father and from you. A portion of the original Ashcroft estate that should have passed to your father and then to you was systematically redirected. Gavin discovered it. He couldn't go to authorities directly because the documents he had access to were obtained in ways that complicated their use.
So he did the only thing he could do. He preserved them and waited. He waited. The word came out rough. He spent his whole life being called a failure, being mocked. They made jokes about him tonight. You heard. And the whole time he was sitting on the truth, Damien said. Yes. Elena stared at the ring in her palm, the engraving. Her father's name in small silver letters, worn soft with years. He came back in. He didn't have to. The ring opens a vault, Damien continued, a private storage facility in the Meridian district that your father rented under a different name. The contents of that vault are what I came here to tell you about, and to offer you a choice. What kind of choice? I have resources, he said carefully. People who can move quickly and quietly in spaces that formal institutions can't access. I also owe your father a debt that I have been carrying for 22 years. He met her eyes. I would like to help you use what's in that vault, but only if you want it. This is your father's legacy and your decision, not mine. The lights in the hall caught the crystal above them and scattered gold across the white tablecloth. Somewhere across the room, Rowan's laughter rose again, easy and careless. The laughter of a man who had been getting away with things for so long that he had forgotten there was anything to get away with. Elena looked at the ring. She looked at Damien Vescari, who had dark, steady eyes and had not touched his wine all evening, and who had apparently spent 22 years keeping a promise to a man who died without anyone in this room caring enough to say his name without contempt. There are people who will try to stop it, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Rowan has lawyers, people. He's been building this for 20 years. I'm aware. And you're... What? You're offering to help me anyway. Damien looked at her steadily. Your father walked into a burning building for a stranger, he said. The least I can do is walk into a boardroom. Elena closed her fingers around the ring and felt the metal press into her palm, warm and solid and entirely real. She was about to speak when the sound of Rowan's microphone feedback cut through the room, silencing the crowd. He had moved back to the head of the table, glass raised, face flushed with the pleasure of an evening going exactly as planned. One more toast, he announced, before we call it a night, to the Ashcroft name, which has survived every challenge this family has faced, and to the next generation, he looked at Marcus, who will carry it forward the way it deserves. The room raised their glasses. Elena looked up at her uncle from the far end of the table. He didn't look at her. She was, as always, not there. She stood up. The movement was quiet, controlled. She tucked the ring carefully into the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest, where she could feel its weight. She picked up her clutch. She looked at Damien Vescari, who had risen silently at the same moment she did, and she said very quietly, so that only he could hear, "Show me the vault." She turned and walked toward the door without looking at Rowan, without looking at Marcus, without looking at any of the faces that had watched her sit at the wrong end of the table all evening and said nothing. But before she reached the entrance hall, she heard Rowan's voice carry across the room one final time, aimed not at her, but at someone near him, careless and loud and entirely confident. Elena always was her father's daughter, stubborn, sentimental, going nowhere. She stopped. She didn't turn around. She breathed, and then she pushed through the door and stepped out into the cold bay air, and Damien Vescari walked beside her, and neither of them spoke until the lights of the estate were behind them. "The vault," she said. "Tonight," he confirmed. "What's going to happen when Rowan finds out we've been there?" Damien was quiet for 3 steps. The wind off the water came in cold and smelled like salt and distance. "He already knows," Damien said finally. "Someone inside that room told him the moment they saw me sit down beside you." Elena stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "What?" "There's someone in your family," he said, "who has been watching for me for years, who knew that if I ever surfaced, it meant the clock had started." His eyes were steady, dark, giving her nothing except the truth. "We don't have until morning, Miss Ashcroft. We may not have until midnight." The bay stretched out to their left, black water catching city lights, indifferent and vast. "Then why are we standing here?" she said. And for the first time all evening, something that might have been respect crossed Damien Vescari's face. He didn't answer.
He simply moved toward the car waiting at the edge of the drive, and Elena Ashcroft, daughter of a man the world called a failure, a woman who had straightened her own place card at a table full of people who wished she hadn't come, followed him into the dark. Behind them, through the tall windows of the estate, she could see the silhouette of Rowan Ashcroft, standing very still now, watching them go. His wineglass was in his hand. He wasn't drinking. The car was a black sedan, older model, nothing that called attention to itself, which Elena suspected was entirely deliberate. The driver didn't turn around when they got in and didn't speak, and Damien didn't introduce him, and Elena decided that was probably the shape of how things worked in whatever world Damien Viscari occupied. She sat in the back beside him with her clutch in her lap and her father's ring pressing against her chest through the fabric of her jacket, and watched the Ashcroft estate shrink in the side mirror until the lights disappeared behind a curve in the coastal road. "Who's the someone?" she said. "Inside the family." Damien was looking out his window. "I don't know yet." "You said someone told Rowan the moment they saw you sit down." "I said that's what would have happened. I don't know who specifically." He paused. "It could be Marcus. It could be someone on Rowan's legal team who was at the dinner. It could be someone on the catering staff who's been on Rowan's payroll for years." He turned from the window. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that Rowan now knows the vault exists and that I've made contact with you." "You said he's known about you for years." "He's known I was out there. He didn't know when I'd move." Something in his expression tightened briefly. "I was careful about that." "Why tonight? Why the dinner?" "Because he was celebrating," Damien said. "Men like Rowan get careless when they're celebrating, and because—" He stopped. "Because what?" "Because I owed it to your father to do it somewhere they thought they were safe." Elena turned that over. Outside the window, the city was opening up around them, the quiet residential streets giving way to the lit grid of Harrow proper, traffic and streetlights, and the particular restless energy of a city at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. She pressed 2 fingers against her jacket pocket, feeling the ring's shape beneath the fabric. "How well did you know him?" she said. "My father." "Well enough." Damien's voice was careful. "We met twice. Once in the warehouse. Once, briefly, 8 years later, when he found me and told me what he'd been building and asked me to be its safeguard." He glanced at her. "He was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone angry." He looked back at the window. He wasn't angry. He was resolved, like he'd already done the hard part, and the rest was just patience. Elena felt something tighten in her throat that she refused to let become anything more. "He was patient," she said. "His whole life." "I know." "They mocked him for it." "I know that too." The car turned onto a long commercial street and slowed. The driver, wordless, efficient, pulled into an underground parking structure and descended 2 levels before finding a space. He cut the engine. Didn't move. Damien opened his door. "The facility is 3 blocks east. We walk from here." "On foot." "Cameras on the street are easier to manage if there's no vehicle registration to attach to them." He stepped out and waited. Elena got out on her side and the cold hit her immediately. October air with a bite in it, smelling of concrete and exhaust. She had dressed for a dinner party, not for this, and the heels she was wearing were wrong for the uneven pavement of the parking structure, but she didn't say anything about it. They walked. Damien set a pace that was fast without appearing rushed, and Elena kept up without being asked to. The 3 blocks were quiet. A late-closing restaurant, a laundry, a shuttered electronics shop with a handwritten sign in the window. The storage facility, when they reached it, was unmarked from the outside, a narrow building pressed between a commercial printer and a parking authority office. Its entrance a gray steel door with a numeric keypad and a camera mounted above it. Damien stopped. He looked at her. "The ring." She reached into her jacket and took it out. It was warm, still, from her body heat. She held it out to him, and he took it gently, careful in a way that felt like something more than practicality, and turned it over until the engraving faced up. Then he pressed the ring flat against what she had taken for a blank panel beside the keypad, and she heard a soft click, and the panel slid aside to reveal a secondary lock mechanism with a small circular recess exactly the size of the ring's inner diameter. "He designed it himself," Damien said. He pressed the ring into the recess and turned it 1/4 clockwise. A second click, deeper. Then he entered a 6-digit code from memory on the keypad, and the steel door swung inward. Elena had been holding her breath without noticing. The interior was small, a corridor of perhaps 15 feet leading to a single storage unit, climate-controlled, the air inside carrying the faint smell of old paper and the particular dryness of a sealed room. Damien found the light, a single overhead fluorescent that took a moment to stabilize, and Elena stepped inside and looked at what her father had built. The unit was maybe 10 feet by 12. Along the left wall, 4 metal filing cabinets, gray, the old military surplus kind that would survive a building collapse. On the back wall, a shelving unit with labeled archive boxes. A folding table in the center with a laptop, ancient, probably 15 years old, and a manila envelope on top of it with her name written in her father's handwriting. She recognized his handwriting instantly, the slightly cramped capitals, the way his sevens had a horizontal bar through them from some old habit she'd never asked him about. Her chest did something complicated. She picked up the envelope first because it was the most urgent thing in the room, the most personal, the thing that had her name on it in her father's hand, and she opened it carefully and unfolded the single page inside. It was dated 7 years ago. Elena, if you're reading this, Damien found you. That means I ran out of time, which I always figured was likely. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but that one most of all. The cabinets on the left contain everything. Financial records, transfer documents, the incorporation papers for the shell companies, correspondence between Rowan and 2 of his legal team going back to 1999. The box labeled Archive 4 on the shelf has the recordings, actual recordings, audio, from meetings I had access to in the early 2000s when Rowan still thought I was too stupid to understand what I was hearing. I need you to know something. I wasn't weak. I know that's what they say. I know that's what they'll keep saying, but I chose this way because the other ways would have put you in danger, and you were 7 years old and you were all I had left of your mother, and there was nothing in the world worth your safety. I chose patience. I chose you. The ring is yours. Everything in this room is yours. Use it. Dad. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope carefully on the table. She pressed both palms flat on the folding table surface and looked at the wall and breathed, slow and deliberate, until the thing in her chest settled enough to be functional. Damien said nothing. He had moved to the filing cabinets and was opening the first one with a quiet efficiency that gave her the space she needed without making a production of giving it. Archive 4, she said when she trusted her voice. Got it. He pulled the box from the shelf and set it on the table beside her and lifted the lid. Inside, 24 small digital voice recorders in individual labeled bags, the kind that were standard in the early 2000s before everything moved to phones. Dates on the labels, some of them spanning multiple sessions. Names she recognized. Rowan, and 2 others. Philip Crane, who was Rowan's chief legal counsel and had been for as long as Elena could remember, and a name she didn't know, D. Mercer. Who's D. Mercer? She said. Damien's hand stilled on the filing cabinet drawer. It was a small stillness, barely a second, but she caught it. A financial architect. He designed the shell company structure that Rowan used to redirect the assets. He closed the drawer. He's also the reason the original legal filings looked clean. Is he still alive? Yes. Damien turned to look at her. He's been working for Rowan for 20 years. He won't be easy to move around. That's not what I was going to ask. Elena looked at the box of recorders. I was going to ask if he's still involved. Yes? She nodded. She picked up one of the labeled bags. September 14th, 2003, RA/PC/office, and held it up. Do these still work? I had the batteries replaced 6 months ago when I decided to move. She looked at him. 6 months ago. I like to be prepared. You decided 6 months ago and you waited until tonight. I told you, I needed the right moment. Elena set the recorder down and turned to face him fully. He was standing at the other end of the folding table, hands at his sides, watching her with that dark, steady attention that she was starting to understand was not coldness,
It was control, and there was a difference. I need to understand something, she said, before we go any further with this. Who are you? Not your name, not the warehouse story. Who are you and what does helping me actually cost you, and what do you get out of it? He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that. A fast answer would have been a prepared answer, and she was done with prepared answers. I run an organization, he said finally. You would call it criminal. The word wouldn't be inaccurate. He said it the way someone states weather, without apology or performance. I have operated in this city for 15 years. I have resources, and I have people, and I have a certain kind of influence that doesn't go through official channels. He paused. What I get out of it is a debt I can finally close. That's the honest answer. And the less honest answer? A beat. Your father was a better man than anyone I've met before or since, including myself. The words came out flat, like they cost something. I don't have a lot of debts I care about. I have this one. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the filing cabinet. Start pulling everything from the first drawer. I need to know what we're working with before we make any plan. They worked for the next 2 hours. The filing cabinets were meticulous. Her father had been meticulous in a way she recognized because she had the same tendency, the same need to label and date and cross-reference, which she had always thought was just her own anxiety, but which now seemed like inheritance, something Gavin had passed down without meaning to. Each folder was dated, tabbed, with a handwritten index on the inside cover listing every document contained. The shell companies, 4 of them, nested, each controlled by the next, were laid out in a chart he had drawn by hand on a large sheet of paper tucked into Archive 2. The chart was old, edges soft with handling, but the handwriting was still clear. At the center of the chart, connected by lines to every subsidiary, Ashcroft Capital Holdings. At the point where assets had been redirected, estimated $47 million, 1999 to 2006. Continued via passive instruments post-2006. Elena stared at the number. 47 million, she said, at minimum. The passive instruments will have generated returns. Damien was going through correspondence folders. Total exposure is likely significantly higher. She sat down on the single folding chair her father had apparently thought to include and looked at the chart and thought about the garage. The 2-room apartment he'd rented near the industrial district when she was growing up. The second-hand school uniforms. The Christmas mornings when the gifts were small and her father's face carried the particular tight cheerfulness of a man trying hard not to let anyone see what holding things together actually cost. The thing in her chest was not grief exactly. It was something older and more compound. Grief cut through with a fury so cold it was almost structural, almost load-bearing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She showed it to Damien. He looked at it. Answer it. She did. Hello? The voice on the other end was Marcus. She recognized it immediately. The flat effect. The control. Where are you? Out. Elena. His voice dropped. Where are you? Why? A pause. She could hear something in the background. A car. Moving. Wind. He was outside. Dad's making calls. He's got people looking for you. Another pause. Come back. Tonight. We can talk about whatever Viscari told you, and we can... You know his name, she said. Silence. Marcus? Her voice was level, absolute. You know his name. You told Rowan. Elena, listen to me. How long have you known about the vault? The silence this time was different in texture, longer. When Marcus spoke again, the control in his voice had frayed at the edges. That's not the right question. How long? Since I was 23. The words came out tight, like they hurt. Dad told me when he brought me into the company, he said there was a risk that your father might have left something behind, that if a man named Viscari ever surfaced, we needed to move immediately. He breathed. Elena, you don't understand what you're walking into. I'm starting to understand it very clearly. He has lawyers. He has the documents your father collected. They were obtained outside legal channels. Any competent defense attorney will... The recordings, she said. Are the recordings outside legal channels? Silence again. Marcus? She leaned forward slightly without thinking. Did you know? Not about the vault?
About what Rowan actually did to my father. The pause before his answer was the most honest thing she'd heard from him in years. I knew it wasn't clean, he said finally. I told myself there were details I wasn't responsible for understanding. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not a no. Elena closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. Don't call me again. She ended the call, put the phone face down on the table. Damien was watching her. He hadn't pretended not to listen. Rowan's moving. Yes. We need to be out of this building in the next 30 minutes. He was already closing archive boxes, moving with the efficient urgency of someone shifting into a different gear. I have a location we can move the materials to. Secure. Rowan doesn't have access to it. How do you know? Because I've made certain of it. He looked at her. Can you carry 2 boxes? Yes. Then let's move. They spent 12 minutes loading what was most critical. The correspondence files, Archive 4 with the recorders, her father's hand-drawn chart, the laptop, into 2 duffel bags Damien produced from behind the shelving unit, the kind of preparedness that told her he had thought through this scenario in several different configurations before arriving at the one they were currently living. She appreciated the preparedness in the same distant way she appreciated competence under pressure, as a category of things she could rely on even if she didn't understand its origins. They were on the street, bags split between them, moving back toward the parking structure, when the SUV appeared. It came from the north end of the block, moving slowly, and it was the slowness that was wrong. On an empty commercial street at midnight, you don't move slowly unless you're looking for something. Elena caught it in her peripheral vision and felt Damien's hand on her arm 2 full seconds before she registered why. Keep walking, he said very quietly. Don't look at it. She kept walking. She didn't look at it. She focused on the entrance of the parking structure 30 meters ahead and matched his pace exactly and thought about her father building a chart by hand in a storage unit and choosing patience over everything else and decided she could manage 30 meters. The SUV stopped. A door opened. Damien said, "Run!" And she ran. She hit the parking structure entrance already at full speed, heels throwing sparks on the concrete, the duffel bag swinging wide, and heard behind her voices, 2 of them, and footsteps. And Damien's own footsteps directly behind her as he pulled the structure's emergency door shut with a metallic crash that bought them perhaps 15 seconds. The driver had the engine running by the time they hit the second level. They threw the bags in the back, and Elena got the door closed a half-second before the car was already moving, ascending the ramp at a speed that the structure's curves were not designed for, and she grabbed the door handle and held on and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. They hit the street, different direction than they'd come. The driver, still wordless, still efficient, took 2 turns in rapid succession and then settled into traffic on a main arterial, just another car among 20, and the parking structure disappeared behind them. Elena let go of the door handle. Her palms were wet. She looked at them, which was a strange thing to do, and then looked at Damien, who was breathing hard for the first time all evening, which made him seem more real and less like an architecture. Who were they? She said. Rowan's people. He pulled his phone out and typed something without looking at her. Private security? Ex-enforcement? He keeps 4 on retainer. How many does he have total? 8. He put his phone away. But some of them will be at the estate for the rest of the night. The ones he sent for us. 2, maybe 3. You knew he'd send people tonight. I knew it was possible. She stared at him. You brought me into that building knowing it was possible he'd send people. I brought you into that building knowing we had a window, and the window was closing. His voice was even. I calculated the risk. You calculated. She stopped herself. The car was quiet except for the engine and the city sounds and her own heartbeat, which she could hear in her ears. She pressed her fists against her knees and held them there. Don't make decisions about my risk without telling me. Agreed, he said, without deflection, without hedging. Just agreed. Like it was simple. She turned and looked out the window. The city moved past, indifferent. Where are we going? A property I control on the west side. Industrial district.
You can work there safely, and so can my people. Your people. I have 3 individuals I trust with this kind of operation. They'll meet us there. He paused. They know who your father was. I told them some time ago when I decided to move. You told strangers about my father. I told people whose discretion I verified over 15 years. His voice was careful, not defensive. They are not strangers to me. Elena turned back from the window. She was aware of being exhausted in a way that had started at the dinner table and had compounded with every hour since, the bone-deep fatigue of a night that had moved too fast in too many directions. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, something tight and clean and without sentimentality. She thought about Marcus on the phone. I told myself there were details I wasn't responsible for understanding, the practiced self-absolution of someone who had always had the option to not look too closely and had exercised it every time. She thought about Rowan at the head of the table, the laugh, the wine glass, the 22 years of celebrating a theft. She reached into the duffel bag at her feet and found Archive 4 by touch and held it on her lap with both hands. Tell me about Philip Crane, she said. Damien looked at her. Why Crane specifically? Because his name is on the recordings, and he's been Rowan's lawyer for as long as I can remember, which means if we move against Rowan, Crane moves first. She looked at Damien. I want to know his weaknesses before we sit down in whatever room you're taking me to. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Crane has a son, he said. Estranged. 26 years old, living in Portland, wants nothing to do with his father's business. Philip has been trying to reestablish contact for 2 years. He paused. He also has a second set of books for his own practice that have nothing to do with Rowan. Strictly his own exposure. Is that useful to us? It depends on how far you want to go. Elena thought about her father's letter on the folding table. Use it. As far as we need to, she said.
The car moved west through the city, and the night compressed around them. The particular density of hours that have already decided what they're going to cost you before you have any say in it. Elena held the archive box in her lap and felt the ring against her chest, and did not look back at where they had come from, because there was no road back to that dinner table. No version of the evening in which she sat in her car and drove home to the apartment that smelled like paint and old radiators and closed the door and pretended Damien Vescari had never placed a silver ring in her trembling hand. That version of the night was over. She had ended it herself when she said, "Show me the vault," and walked out of her uncle's house without looking back. And she understood now, in the cold back seat of a car moving through a city that didn't know or care what was happening inside it, that ending it had been the first real decision she had made in years. Her phone lit up on her lap. Not a call this time. A message, from a number she didn't recognize, a different number than Marcus had called from. 4 words. We have the originals. She stared at the screen, then she held the phone out to Damien. He read it. His jaw set. Whatever he had been calculating before, the calculation had just changed, and she could see it in the specific stillness that moved through him. Not fear. She didn't think Damien Vescari experienced fear in any conventional sense, but the recognition of a variable that had not been in the model. What originals? She said. Your father made copies of everything in the vault, Damien said slowly, which means there are originals somewhere. He looked at her, and for the first time all night his voice carried something underneath the control that sounded like it might, in a different man, have been alarm. I didn't know about originals. Then who does? The car hit a red light and stopped. In the sudden stillness, the city sounds came in close. Traffic, somewhere a siren, wind off the bay. Someone who has been inside this longer than I have, Damien said. Elena looked at the message again. We have the originals. No demand, no instruction, just a statement. A door left slightly open in the dark. That's not a threat, she said. No. It's an introduction. Yes. She looked up at Damien. There's someone else. There's someone else, he confirmed, and his voice had gone very quiet in a way that was more unsettling than anything that had happened in the parking structure. Because whatever was in those 4 words, whatever door they had opened, Damien Vescari, who had spent 22 years being the most prepared man in any room, had not seen it coming. The light turned green, the car moved, and in Elena Ashcroft's lap, her phone screen went dark, and the 4 words disappeared. And somewhere in the city, a third player waited in the silence they had made, holding something her father had hidden from everyone, including the man he had trusted with his ring. The property on the west side was a converted warehouse, the kind that had been industrial once and still looked it from the outside. Corrugated steel walls, a loading dock with the chains removed, windows along the upper story painted over from the inside. The driver pulled into a rear courtyard enclosed by a chain-link fence and killed the engine, and that was the full extent of the arrival ceremony. Inside was different. Not comfortable exactly, but functional in a way that suggested long occupation. Folding tables with laptops, a wall of monitors showing camera feeds from the building's exterior, a kitchenette with a coffee machine that was already running, and 3 people who looked up when Damien came through the door and didn't look surprised by anything, including Elena. "This is Reyes," Damien said, indicating a compact woman in her 30s with close-cropped hair and the kind of watchful stillness that suggested she had spent significant time in rooms where being still was a survival skill. "Logistics and surveillance. Tomas?" A tall man with a scarred jaw who nodded without standing. "Legal analysis, document authentication." And Ren. Ren was younger than the others, mid-20s, slight, with the particular intensity of someone who lived inside their own head and occasionally remembered there were other people in the room. She was already looking at the duffel bags. "Are those the archive materials?" "Most of them," Elena said. Ren reached for the nearest bag. "I'll start with the recordings." "Not yet." Damien's voice was quiet, but it stopped Ren's hand. He set his own bag on the nearest table and looked at all 3 of them. "We have a complication." He handed Tomas Elena's phone with the message still on screen. Tomas read it. Passed it to Reyes. Reyes read it and looked at Elena and then at Damien with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that probably meant something was happening underneath it. "We have the originals," Reyes repeated. "Someone else knows about the vault." "Someone else has been inside this longer than we have," Damien said, "or has access to information I don't." "That narrows it," Tomas said, setting the phone down. "People who knew Gavin Ashcroft well enough to know about the documents. People who would have had reason to make a separate set." "Or people Gavin told," Elena said. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone says something that reorients everything. "Your father trusted you with what was in this vault," Damien said carefully. "Is there anyone else he might have trusted with something he considered even more important than the copies?" Elena thought about it, really thought, standing in a warehouse at midnight with the taste of exhaustion at the back of her throat, running through the geography of her father's life as she understood it. The garage, the apartment, the handful of people who had circled through both with enough frequency to matter. Her father had been, by nature and by necessity, a private man. Not unfriendly, private. The kind of man who told you exactly what you needed to know and kept the rest folded carefully somewhere you couldn't accidentally stumble into it. "There was a woman," she said slowly, "Nora Vass. She was his bookkeeper for the garage for about 8 years. She and my father," she stopped, recalibrated. "They were close. For a while. She moved out of the city when I was about 16 and I never had a way to reach her." Reyes was already at a laptop. "Nora Vass. Spell it." Elena spelled it. "How close is close?" Damien asked. "They were together, not officially. My father didn't do official." She paused. "He trusted her. In the practical way, not just the... He let her handle his accounts. The real ones." Reyes looked up from the laptop. "I've got a Nora Vass, 61 years old, listed at an address in the Garfield neighborhood. That's 20 minutes from here." "She's still in the city," Elena said. "She never left," Reyes said. "The address on file has been continuous for 11 years. Something about that sat wrong and right at the same time. Elena looked at Damien. "She told my father she was leaving." "Maybe she lied," Damien said. "Or maybe she was told to disappear for her own safety, and staying was the smarter version of it." He looked at Reyes. "Can you get eyes on the address?" 15 minutes. "Do it,"
He turned to Tomas. Start on the document authentication. I want to know which materials are going to hold up and which ones are going to be challenged before we decide what order to move in. He looked at Ren. The recordings. Start with anything dated 2003 and earlier. That's the period with the highest exposure for Rowan. Ren nodded and reached for Archive 4, and this time nobody stopped her. Damien looked at Elena. You should sleep. I'm not going to sleep. I know. I said you should, not that you would. He moved to the kitchenette. Coffee. It wasn't a question. She sat down at one of the folding tables and pulled the nearest laptop toward her and started going through the financial documents she had photographed with her phone during the 2 hours at the vault, because doing something with her hands was the only way she knew to keep the exhaustion from becoming something she couldn't work around. The night moved in the particular way that nights move when you have too much to do and not enough information, and someone somewhere is making moves you can't see yet. Ren worked through the recordings with headphones, occasionally stopping to make notes. Tomas went through folders with the focused attention of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what he was looking for. Reyes ran surveillance and made quiet calls in a language Elena didn't recognize. At 2:15 in the morning, Reyes pulled off her headset and said, "There's a car outside the Vass address. Been there for 40 minutes. Different plates than what's registered on the street." Damien set down his coffee. Rowan's people? Or the third parties? Can you distinguish? Not from here. Reyes looked at him steadily. I'd need to go in person. No. Damien was quiet for a moment. We go to her before they do, all three of us. He looked at Elena. If she knows you, she'll talk to you. She won't talk to me. She might not talk to me either. It's been 11 years. She sent you a message tonight. She talked to you. Elena looked at her phone. The dark screen. 4 words from a stranger who wasn't a stranger. You think it was her. I think a woman who is close to your father, who has been quietly staying in a city she told everyone she'd left, who apparently has possession of original documents your father trusted with no one else. Yes, I think it was her. He pulled on his jacket. I think she's been waiting for the same moment I was waiting for, and she moved when she saw me make contact. They left Tomas and Ren with the materials and drove to Garfield with Reyes at the wheel. Nobody speaking. The city at 2 in the morning reduced to its skeleton. Trucks, a few lit windows, the occasional pedestrian who had somewhere they needed to be and wasn't interested in anyone else's business. The address was a narrow row house on a residential block. Brick, well-maintained, a light on in the second-floor window. The car Reyes had flagged was parked 3 houses down. A dark blue SUV, engine off, no visible occupant, but the slight condensation on the windshield that meant someone had been inside recently. Rowan's, Damien said quietly. Reyes parked on the opposite end of the block. They're watching the house. They haven't gone in. They're waiting for her to lead them somewhere. Damien looked at Elena. Which means they don't know she has the originals yet. They think she might be a contact. If we go to the door, they'll know, Elena said. Yes. He looked at the lit window. But if we don't, and they move first, then we lose whatever she has. Elena opened her car door. I'll go alone. A woman knocking on a door at 2 in the morning is less alarming than, no. Damien. She looked at him directly. I'm the one she reached out to. I'm the one with the name she knows. You going to the door with me makes it harder, not easier. She held his gaze. I understand the risk. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then, Reyes watches the SUV. If it moves, you get out of the house regardless of where you are in the conversation. Agreed. She got out and walked to the house at a pace that she hoped looked like someone returning from a late shift rather than someone on the wrong side of a very fast-moving night. The front steps were concrete, 4 of them. The doorbell was the old mechanical kind. She pressed it and heard it ring inside and stood on the top step in her dinner party clothes and her wrong shoes and waited. The light in the second-floor window moved. Footsteps on stairs. The door opened on a chain first, the 3-inch gap of it, and one eye appeared in the gap. And then a voice Elena had not heard in 11 years said her name in a tone that was equal parts relief and something that sounded uncomfortably like dread. Elena. Nora. She kept her voice steady. Can I come in? The chain came off. Nora Vass was 61 and looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had developed the particular posture of people who carry heavy things, slightly forward, slightly braced. Her hair was gray now, entirely, pulled back. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she had apparently been wearing when the doorbell rang. She was dressed like someone who had not been sleeping. She led Elena into the kitchen without explanation, which was in itself a kind of information. The kitchen was small and had good light and a table with papers on it, which Nora swept together quickly without being obvious about it. But Elena had sharp eyes and tired patience, and she caught enough to see that the papers were financial documents of a type she had spent the last 4 hours studying. You sent the message, Elena said. Nora filled the kettle and plugged it in. Your father gave me a number. He said if a man named Vescari ever made contact with you, I should send it. She set 2 cups on the table with the automatic efficiency of someone managing her hands while her mind was somewhere else. He said you'd need to know you weren't alone in it. The originals. I have them. Yes. Nora turned to look at her. I've had them for 9 years. Gavin brought them to me himself. He didn't... She stopped, rearranged. He said the copies in the vault were the ones he could afford to lose if they were found. The originals were the ones that would actually matter in court. Why you? Because nobody was looking at me. She said it simply, without self-pity and without drama. I was the garage bookkeeper. I left the city, or seemed to. I had no official connection to the Ashcroft family beyond a few years of low-level employment. Nobody looking at Rowan's threat landscape was going to look at me. She turned back to the kettle. That was the point. Elena sat down at the table. There's a car outside, blue SUV, been there 40 minutes. Nora didn't react visibly. She poured the water, brought the cups, sat down across from Elena. I know, they showed up an hour ago. I've been deciding whether to call the number Gavin gave me or wait for you to come. She wrapped both hands around her cup. You came. Where are the originals, Nora? Nora looked at her. In the kitchen light, she looked tired in a specific way. Not the tiredness of tonight, but the tiredness of years, the kind that doesn't leave with sleep. Your father loved you very much, she said. I know. He talked about you constantly, from the day you were born. She paused. He was terrified the whole time he was building the case, not of Rowan, of what would happen to you if you moved too early. She pressed her lips together. He made me promise, if anything happened to him before the time was right, I would wait. I would not move independently. I would wait until you were ready. I'm ready, Elena said. I can see that. Nora looked at her with something that wasn't quite maternal and wasn't quite not. The documents are in the house. I'll give them to you. She stood up and then paused. There's something else in them, something your father didn't include in the vault copies, something he was uncertain about, whether to use it. Elena felt the hairs on her forearm prick up beneath her sleeve. What kind of something? Correspondence, Nora said, between Rowan and a federal official, going back to 2001. She said it with the flatness of someone who has had 9 years to get used to the weight of a thing and has only partially succeeded. The official ran interference on 2 separate occasions when Gavin tried to report what he'd found through back channels. The complaints disappeared. The contact was buried. She paused. The official's name is Judge Carla Menem. She's been on the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals for 6 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena heard the kettle clicking as it cooled. She heard her own breathing, which was slower than she would have expected, which was probably the body's way of managing the size of what had just been said. A federal judge, compromised, on record, for over 20 years. That's why my father hesitated, Elena said. He was afraid it would destroy the case instead of strengthen it. That Mene would move first, use her position to invalidate the evidence before it could be examined. Nora sat back down. He also knew that without it, Rowan's legal team would go straight for procedural dismissal and they might succeed. She looked at Elena steadily. It cuts both ways. That's why he left it out of the vault. He left the decision to me. He left the decision to whoever was in the room when the time came. Nora's eyes were steady, tired, honest.
He hoped it would be you. Elena stared at the table surface. The grain of the wood, a faint ring from a coffee cup long past. Get the documents, she said. Nora went upstairs. Elena texted Damien. She has originals. Federal judge involved. Stay put. The reply came back in under 30 seconds. How bad? She typed, bad enough. The wait while Nora was upstairs was perhaps 4 minutes, and Elena spent them studying the kitchen, the way she studied things when she needed her brain to be doing something while the rest of her caught up. The shelves, organized with the quiet precision of someone who lived alone and had made peace with it. The photographs on the refrigerator, a few. And she got up to look at them and found what she was half expecting. One of them was her father, younger than she remembered, standing in front of the garage with his arms crossed and squinting into the sun with the specific expression of a man who is trying not to look happy about something and failing. She put one finger on the photograph, just for a second. Nora came back down with a fireproof document box, the kind that could survive a house fire, and set it on the table. Elena opened it. The originals were everything the copies had promised and more. Sharper, complete, with original signatures rather than reproductions. The kind of materials that a forensic accountant and a federal prosecutor would treat as primary evidence rather than corroboration. And at the back, in a separate folder marked in her father's handwriting, simply M, the correspondence with Carla Mene. 8 letters. Emails, printed. Mene's official court email on 2 of them. The content was not explicit, not stupid. Rowan was not a stupid man. But it was specific enough, specific in the coded language of people who knew they were saying something that couldn't be said plainly, and it was dated, and it was signed, and it was enough. Elena was reading the 3rd letter when her phone vibrated. Reyes. SUV is moving. She was on her feet before the sentence finished loading. Nora, we have to go. Now. Nora was already moving, but not panicked, controlled, the movement of someone who had thought through this moment. She went to a cabinet by the back door and pulled out a coat and a bag that had clearly been packed in advance. And Elena revised upward her estimate of Nora Vass's preparation significantly. Back door, Nora said. They went through the back door into a narrow alley between the row houses, and Elena was texting Reyes as they moved. Alley behind the house, east end. And behind them she heard the front door of the house receive a very firm knock. The knock of people who are not planning to knock twice. Reyes had the car at the alley entrance 40 seconds later. They got in, Nora in the back with Elena, the document box between them, and Reyes was already moving before the doors were fully closed. Nobody spoke for 90 seconds. Then Nora looked at Elena in the passing dark and said, They knew where I lived. Yes. They've known for a while. Probably. Then they've been waiting too. Nora looked out the back window. No one following. Not yet. What changed tonight? What made them move? Damien Viscari showed up at the Ashcroft dinner, Elena said. Nora closed her eyes briefly, opened them. He was supposed to be untraceable. He was, until he wasn't. Elena looked at the document box. Rowan had someone watching for him, inside the family. Marcus, Nora said immediately. You know about Marcus. Gavin knew Marcus had been told. He found out 3 years before he died. Nora's voice was steady in the way of someone reciting a fact they've had time to stop feeling about. It changed his timeline. He'd been planning to move when you were 30. Marcus knowing moved everything earlier in his mind, but then he got sick and... She stopped. And then he was gone. The car moved west, then north, taking the route back to the warehouse by a different path than they'd come. Elena held the document box and looked at Nora and understood that this woman had been sitting alone in a city she was supposed to have left, with a fireproof box full of evidence that could topple a federal judge, waiting for 11 years. Why did you stay? Elena said. Nora looked at her. Where would I go? Back at the warehouse, the dynamic of the room shifted immediately when Nora walked in. Tomas looked up from his documents and something moved across his face. Not recognition, but the recalibration of a man who has just received new data about the shape of a problem. Ren pulled her headphones off entirely. Reyes moved to the monitors without being asked. Damien looked at Nora for 3 seconds without speaking, Then he said, "You were the second safeguard." "Gavin's word for it," Nora said. "Yes." "He didn't tell me." "He didn't tell you because he didn't know if you'd still be—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Operational by the time Elena needed you. He needed a redundancy you couldn't know about." She looked at him without apology. "He trusted you. He just didn't trust circumstances." Damien was quiet for a moment. Something passed through his expression that Elena couldn't read entirely. Not offense, she thought, but the impact of a truth that recontextualizes things. He nodded once. "Understood." Nora set the document box on the central table, and Tomas was on it immediately, gloved, careful, with the focused absorption of a man who lived for exactly this kind of material. Ren leaned in beside him. Elena stood back and watched them work and felt the exhaustion pressing at her again, heavier this time, the weight of everything the night had been. She was watching Tomas's face when it changed. He had been going through the Mene correspondence with the steady professional attention he'd brought to everything else, and then he stopped, and he went very still. And he picked up one of the printed emails and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "Tomas," Damien said. Tomas looked up. He looked at Elena. His expression was doing something complicated and careful. "There's a name in this correspondence I wasn't expecting." Elena moved to the table. She looked at the email he was holding. It was dated 2004, Rowan to Many, and she read it quickly because by now she had the shape of his writing in her head. The formality that was a performance, the way he buried the operative sentence in the middle of a paragraph like something he was hoping you'd skim past. She found the sentence. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time because the first two times hadn't made the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. As discussed, the mechanic's daughter has been accounted for in the secondary arrangement. The Meridian Trust instrument names her as a conditional beneficiary under Crane's oversight, which gives us sufficient control over any future claim regardless of what Gavin does or doesn't do between now and his natural end. "Secondary arrangement," Elena said. Her voice came out strange, flat and strange. "It means there's a trust instrument," Tomas said carefully, "with your name on it, under Philip Crane's oversight." He paused. "Elena, a trust instrument with a conditional beneficiary clause and oversight assigned to Rowan's lawyer means that even if you successfully bring this case, Crane controls the outcome," she said. "Crane controls what you can access and when. And if Crane is compromised, which he is, then you could win the case and still walk away with nothing." Tomas set the email down. "Or worse, if Crane moves the trust before the case concludes, the assets could be transferred in ways that are technically legal and very difficult to reverse." The room was very quiet. Elena looked at the email, then at the document box, then at the wall above the monitors, which showed the exterior of the warehouse, empty street, a parked truck, the ordinary, uninterested landscape of a city going about its business. "My father knew about this," she said. "I don't think he did," Nora said quietly. She was standing at the edge of the table, looking at the email with an expression that was the closest thing to grief Elena had seen on her face all night. "He documented everything he could find, but Crane set up the trust through a subsidiary entity that isn't directly linked to any of the other shell companies in your father's chart. He would have had to know to look specifically for it." "Which means Rowan built a failsafe," Damien said. "He built it around me," Elena said. She heard how that sounded. She heard what it meant. 22 years ago, her uncle had stolen from her father and redirected $47 million and built an empire on the theft. And somewhere in the architecture of the theft, he had put a clause with her name on it. Not out of sentiment, not out of any residual obligation to his dead brother's daughter, but as a mechanism of control, a legal instrument designed to ensure that even if the truth came out, even if everything her father had built in that storage unit was laid in front of a judge, there was a hand already on the wheel that would steer the outcome back to Rowan. She had been in the plan all along. She just hadn't known it. "Can we break the trust instrument?" she said. Tomas took a breath. "If Crane has been maintaining it in good faith, it's very difficult. If we can demonstrate he's acted with conflict of interest. He's been on Rowan's payroll for 20 years. Demonstrating that's in the specific context of the trust requires evidence that directly links Crane's trust management decisions to Rowan's instructions, not just general evidence of their relationship. Is that evidence in what we have? Thomas looked at the email, at the box, at the folders Reyes had photographed from the vault. I need 2 hours to be certain, but he paused, and she could see him being careful, being honest rather than reassuring, which she respected even as it cost her something. I don't know, Elena. I don't know yet. Wren, who had been quiet for several minutes, spoke without looking up from her laptop. There might be a faster way. Everyone looked at her. Crane's son, she said. The estranged one, Portland. Damien looked at her. What about him? If Crane has been managing a trust instrument with Elena as the beneficiary, the son would potentially be a secondary beneficiary, or at minimum would appear in the estate documents. She turned the laptop to show the screen. She had been researching, Elena realized, the whole time they'd been talking. His name is Daniel Crane. He's a licensed CPA in Portland. He's been licensed for 4 years. She looked at the room. CPAs are mandatory reporters. If he has any knowledge of fraudulent trust management in his father's practice, he'd be legally obligated to report it, Thomas said slowly. And if we contact him first before Rowan can, Wren continued, with evidence of what his father's been involved in, he either moves to protect himself or he moves to protect his father. Either way, we learn something. Elena looked at Damien. He was looking at Wren with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward. How old are those estrangement records? The last public connection between them on record is 6 years ago. A property transfer, Philip to Daniel, which Daniel subsequently sold. No contact on social platforms, no shared professional affiliations. Wren pushed her glasses up. Estranged is the right word. Then he has no reason to protect his father, Elena said. No reason we can see, Damien said. People's reasons for protecting their parents are not always visible. He looked at Elena, but it's worth the contact. I'll go, Elena said. Portland is 3 hours by car. She looked at the clock on the warehouse wall. It was 3:47 in the morning. I can be there before he goes to work. You haven't slept. I'm aware. She looked at him steadily. You said you owed my father a debt. Help me get to Portland and help me find Daniel Crane before Rowan figures out his son exists as a variable in this. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes. Reyes was already checking her phone. I can have a car ready in 10 minutes, Reyes said. Do it. He looked back at Elena. I'm coming with you. You don't have to. I'm coming with you, he said again, and his voice had the quality of a sentence that has already finished the discussion it's part of, and Elena let it go. She turned to Nora, who was standing quietly at the edge of the room with her packed bag and her 11 years of waiting and her expression of someone who has put down a thing they've been carrying so long, they're not entirely sure who they are without the weight of it. Stay here, Elena said. Tomas will keep you safe. When we get back, I know what to do, Nora said. She looked at Elena with those tired, steady eyes. Your father would be... She stopped, started again differently. You're doing right by him. Elena nodded once. She didn't trust herself to say anything to that. She picked up the document box, put her father's ring inside it against the originals where it belonged, and zipped her jacket against the cold she knew would be waiting outside. 10 minutes, she said to the room. Wren was already on the phone. Tomas was photographing documents. Reyes was moving toward the door. And somewhere in the city, in his waterfront estate with the long table and the white orchids, and the weight of 22 years of theft sitting beneath the floors like something buried, Rowan Ashcroft was making calls that Elena could feel the shape of without hearing them. Fast, controlled, precise. Because men like Rowan, men who had been building and protecting and calculating for 2 decades, did not make the mistake of moving slowly when they understood the ground had shifted. He knew she had the vault materials. He knew she had reached Nora. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't know yet, was what Nora had been holding. He didn't know about Mene. He didn't know about Daniel Crane. And he didn't know, couldn't know, that Elena Ashcroft, who had sat at the wrong end of his table and straightened her own place card and eaten dinner in silence while his room laughed at her father's memory,
had in the space of 6 hours moved from the worst seat in the house to the only position in the entire board that he had failed to account for. She walked out into the dark. The car was waiting, but as she reached the door, her phone lit up one more time. Not Reyes, not Marcus. A number she hadn't seen before, local prefix, and when she answered it, there was a half-second of open line before a voice she had never heard, male, older, with the flat, careful diction of someone who has spent years choosing every word for its legal weight, said, "Miss Ashcroft, my name is Philip Crane. I think it's time we spoke directly, before this goes any further." A pause, deliberate, shaped. "I have information about your father that Viscari doesn't know. Information that changes everything you think you understand about why Gavin Ashcroft never—" Elena didn't answer immediately. She stood at the warehouse door with the cold at her back and Damien 3 feet away, and Philip Crane's voice sitting in the air between her ear and the phone like something with weight, and she counted 3 full seconds before she spoke. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I get most things," Crane said. "I pay attention to what other people overlook." A pause. Not nervous. Careful. The pause of a man who has been careful for 20 years and knows the difference between the two. "I know where you are. I know what you found tonight. And I know that if you get in a car to Portland in the next 10 minutes, you'll be walking into a situation that will end this before it starts." Damien had moved close enough to hear. Elena tilted the phone slightly toward him. He listened. "Daniel Crane is already gone," Philip said. "Rowan's people reached him 40 minutes ago. He's been moved to a location I don't have access to, which is Rowan's way of telling me something without saying it." A breath. The first sign of something underneath the careful voice. "My son has nothing to do with this. He's never had anything to do with this. And Rowan is using him to make sure I stay in my lane for the next 72 hours. Elena looked at Damien. His jaw had set. "You managed a trust instrument with my name on it," she said. "For 20 years. Yes. On Rowan's instructions. Yes. And now you want to talk." "I want to give you something," Crane said, "in exchange for Daniel. I don't have your son. No. But you have the means to force Rowan to release him, and you know it." Another pause. "Meet me. 1 hour. The Caulfield parking structure on Merchant Street, level 4. Alone." "Absolutely not," Damien said, quietly but without ambiguity. "The man with you is not invited," Crane said, and Elena realized the phone was loud enough that Crane could hear ambient sound. This conversation doesn't happen with Viscari present. "Give me a reason," Elena said. "Because what I'm going to tell you about your father," Crane said slowly, "is something that Viscari has spent 22 years not knowing, and once you hear it, you'll need to decide by yourself whether to use it. Not him. You." The voice had dropped lower. Gavin Ashcroft made one choice that had nothing to do with the evidence or the vault or the ring. One choice that was purely personal. I was the only witness, and it changes the weight of everything you're about to do. Elena looked at Damien. He shook his head. Not a suggestion. A position. She looked at the document box in her hand. Her father's ring inside it against the originals. The letter he'd written, "Use it." 1 hour, she said. She ended the call before Damien could object and turned to face him. He was looking at her with an expression that had passed through several things and arrived at something that was controlled effort. "No," he said. "He has information we don't have. He's Rowan's lawyer. He's a man whose son just got picked up as leverage, which means he's no longer exclusively Rowan's anything." She held Damien's gaze. "And he knows something about my father. Something you don't know. That's exactly why it's a trap." "Maybe." She put her phone in her pocket. "But the Portland option is closed. Daniel Crane is gone. What's our alternative play right now, Damien? Because I ran the board on the drive here and I'm not seeing it." He was quiet. She watched him run it. She could see it in the specific tension of his face, the way his eyes went slightly distant, cycling through variables and outcomes with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years making decisions under pressure. "Not alone," he said finally. He said, "I heard what he said." His voice was flat. "You go in. I'm in the structure. If anything moves wrong, I'm 2 minutes away.
He looked at her. 2 minutes, Elena. You give me that. Fine. And you wear this. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small device, flat, the size of a thumbnail. Audio. Live feed to Reyes. She took it and pressed it inside the collar of her jacket where the fabric folded. Let's go. The call field structure was 8 minutes away. They rode in silence except for Reyes confirming the audio was live, and Damien on a second phone giving terse instructions she didn't try to parse. The structure was old, poured concrete, the kind that smelled like oil and standing water on every level. At 4 a.m, it was almost entirely empty. A handful of vehicles left overnight, the distant sound of a ventilation system that had been running since the building was constructed. Level 4. Elena got out of the car, alone on level 3, and took the stairs up, her heels loud on the concrete in a way she couldn't do anything about. Level 4 opened onto a broad expanse of empty spaces. Yellow lane markings faded to near invisibility, one overhead light out so that half the level was in the kind of dark that has textures. Philip Crane was standing beside a gray sedan in the lit half. He was 60-something, lean in the way lawyers get lean. Not from health, but from the steady consumption of stress over decades.
He had his coat on and his hands visible, which she noted. No one with him that she could see. She crossed the level at a pace that was neither hurried nor cautious. Stopped 6 feet from him. Up close, he looked like a man who had not slept and had been thinking hard about the architecture of a decision that had already been made. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Talk." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief and was probably something that had no clean name. "Your father came to me in 2006, he said. "That's where this starts. Not with Rowan, not with the documents, with Gavin." Elena waited. "He came to my office, alone. He'd been building the case for 7 years by then, and he wasn't angry, which surprised me. He laid out everything he had on my desk, and he looked at me and he said he knew I'd been helping Rowan structure the transfers." Crane paused. "He could have gone to the Bar Association. He could have used what he had against me directly. He didn't." He paused again, longer. "He offered me a choice." "What kind of choice?" "He said if I helped him, not against Rowan, not yet, just passively, just stopped actively participating in new transfers, and left the existing documentation in a state that could be read clearly by someone who knew what to look for, he would exclude my name from what he eventually gave to prosecutors." Crane looked at the concrete floor. "He said he wasn't interested in destroying everyone. He was interested in the truth about what was done to him." Elena felt something move in her chest. "Did you take it?" "I stopped actively participating that same week." He looked up. "The trust instrument with your name. I set it up in 2004 before he came to me. After 2006, I managed it in a way that protected your access, not Rowan's. The conditional language that looks like a control mechanism, I drafted it with the conditions structured so that a competent attorney could satisfy them in 48 hours with the right evidentiary base." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a legal memorandum I prepared 18 months ago, when I could see this was coming. It explains exactly how to satisfy the trust conditions and transfer full control to you immediately upon filing." She didn't take it yet. "You've been sitting on this for 18 months. I've been waiting for the moment Rowan's exposure was complete enough that he couldn't pressure me into withdrawing it." His voice was even. "That moment is tonight. Because tonight you have the Mene correspondence, and if that goes to a federal oversight body, Rowan's ability to apply pressure through legal channels collapses within weeks." Elena took the document. She didn't open it. "What does this cost?" "Daniel," he said it simply. "My son has nothing to do with any of this. He left because he found out what I was involved in, and he couldn't live with it, which—" He stopped. Something moved through his face that was probably the closest to unguarded he'd been in years. "He was right to leave. I need him safe. I'm not the one who took him." "No, but you're the one who can make Rowan let him go." He looked at her steadily. "If you use the Mene correspondence correctly, through the right federal oversight channel, not through local prosecutors who are too close to Rowan's network, Rowan will spend every resource he has on damage control.
He won't have the bandwidth to hold Daniel as leverage, and he'll know that anything that happens to Daniel after the filing will look like witness intimidation, which compounds his exposure exponentially. Elena looked at him. You've thought this through. I've had 18 months. What channel? She said. Specifically, the Office of Professional Conduct for the Ninth Circuit. They have independent jurisdiction over judicial conduct complaints, and they don't go through Mene's court or any court she has influence over. He reached back into his coat and produced a second document. Filing instructions, prepared. Everything you need to submit the Mene materials through the correct intake process. He held it out. You file tonight, digitally. It's a 40-minute process. And by morning, there's a federal record that can't be made to disappear. She took the second document. She stood in the parking structure at 4 a.m. with her father's enemy's lawyer handing her the mechanism to do what her father had spent 20 years building toward. And she understood with a cold clarity that the world was rarely arranged into clean categories of people who were against you and people who were for you, that most people were just trying to manage what they'd done and what they owed and what they were afraid of, and that Philip Crane was specifically, precisely, a man who had made wrong choices for 20 years and one right one, and she was going to use the right one. If this filing doesn't work, she said, it will work. If it doesn't, he met her eyes. Then you use everything else you have and I'll testify, in person, on record. He said it with the steadiness of a man who has decided something and is done deciding it. My name, my involvement, everything. I'll give it all. He paused. But it will work. She nodded once, turned and walked back toward the stairwell without looking back. Behind her, she heard him, Your father was a better man than I deserved. She kept walking. She went down the stairs, and Damien was at the bottom, moving toward her before she hit the last step, and she handed him both documents without breaking stride and said, Back to the warehouse. We're filing tonight. He read the first document in the car, while Reyes drove with controlled urgency, and Elena sat beside him and watched his face process it. The careful legal eye moving through Crane's memo, the slight shift in his expression when he understood what it meant for the trust instrument, the particular stillness that settled over him when he reached the filing instructions for the OPC. He's giving you the whole mechanism, Damien said. Yes. Why? His son. Beyond that. Elena looked out the window. Because my father gave him a way out 16 years ago, and he's been carrying the debt ever since. She paused. Some people need a long time to pay what they owe. Damien was quiet for a moment, then, the filing. We need to verify the OPC intake process is what he says it is before you submit anything. That's what Tomas is for. Yes. Then let's move. The warehouse at 4:30 in the morning had the particular atmosphere of a place where people have been working for hours and have passed through tired into something harder and more functional on the other side of it. Tomas had 3 displays going. Ren had a timeline on the wall, actual paper, taped up, a physical chronology of events and documents and names that now stretched across most of the east wall. Nora was asleep on a folding cot in the corner, which was the most human thing in the room. Elena put both of Crane's documents on the central table. Tomas, the second one. I need the OPC intake process verified against public record. Tonight. Tomas picked it up and started reading. Ren moved to his shoulder. Elena looked at the timeline on the wall. It was comprehensive. It was everything her father had built, everything Nora had held, everything the night had uncovered, laid out in Ren's precise handwriting in a sequence that had its own terrible logic. She followed it with her eyes from the first entry, 1999. Initial asset diversion, Rowan to Ashcroft Holdings, Shell A. To the last one Ren had added, which was time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Crane contact. Trust memo. OPC filing pathway. She found her own name in the middle of it, 2004. Elena Ashcroft named conditional beneficiary, Meridian Trust. A line connecting it to Crane. A line connecting it to Rowan. And one small notation in different ink that Ren had added sometime in the last hour. Protection mechanism? See Crane memo. She touched the notation with one finger. Tomas, she said. Give me 4 minutes. She gave him 4 minutes. She drank the cold coffee that was still in the pot from however many hours ago, and she stood at the wall and she thought about her father in a storage unit building something he knew he might never be the one to use. OPC intake process checks out, Tomas said. Digital filing, 24-hour acknowledgement, independent of circuit court oversight. The pathway is clean. He looked at her. If the many materials are as strong as the correspondence suggests. They are, Nora said from the corner. Everyone looked at her. She was awake. Had been awake, Elena thought, for longer than she was letting on. I read all of them 9 years ago, Nora said, sitting up. Twice. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what I read and I know what it meant. She looked at Elena. They're enough. Then we file now, Elena said. It's 4:43 in the morning, Damien said. Digital intake is 24 hours. She looked at him. We file now. There's a federal record before business hours. Before Rowan can make calls to people who might slow it down. Before anything else moves. Damien held her gaze for a moment. Then, Ren, set up the filing interface. Ren was already moving. The next 40 minutes were the most technically exacting of the night. Tomas prepared the submission package with the care of someone who understood that a procedural error at this stage would be worse than a delay. The Mene correspondence, organized by date and annotated with cross-references to the shell company documentation, the financial records that established the motive, a brief cover statement that Thomas drafted in the flat, precise language of federal complaint filings, and Elena read 3 times and approved. The audio recordings were referenced but not submitted in the initial package. Admissibility questions, Tomas explained, better introduced through the follow-up process once the initial complaint triggered an investigation. Elena signed the filing statement with her name and her contact information and her attorney of record designation, which meant Thomas, which meant she was trusting a man she'd known for 6 hours with her legal exposure, and she made that calculation in about 4 seconds and stood by it. At 5:22 in the morning, Ren hit submit. The acknowledgement came back in 11 minutes. Case intake confirmed. Reference number assigned. Assigned to the OPC duty officer for preliminary review. The room was very quiet. Then Reyes said from the monitors, "We have a problem." Everyone turned. On the central monitor, exterior camera, north side of the warehouse building. 3 vehicles had stopped in the street. Not parked. Stopped, in a configuration that was specific and deliberate, the configuration of people who have done this before and know where to put themselves. How many? Damien said, already moving. I count 8. Could be more in the vehicles. Reyes's voice was the flattest Elena had heard it. They're in position. Rowan's people. Has to be. Reyes looked at him. He made us. I don't know when, but he made us. The parking structure, Elena said. The camera in the structure. Doesn't matter how, Damien said. He turned to the room with the quick, comprehensive look of someone doing triage. Tomas, Nora, Ren. The back corridor leads to the adjacent building. Through the loading dock, out the south end, 2 blocks to the commercial lot on Ferris. There's a car there. He looked at Reyes. Keys. Reyes tossed them without looking up from the monitors. Gray hatchback, lot B. Go, now. Take the original documents. Tomas was already moving. Ren grabbed Archive 4. Nora picked up her bag from the floor beside the cot with the readiness of someone who had never entirely stopped being ready. Elena picked up the document box. Not you, Damien said. She looked at him. You go with them. No. Elena. The filing is in, she said. They can't unmake it. But if Rowan gets to those vehicles before Tomas and Ren clear the building, we lose everything we haven't submitted yet, and we lose our people. She looked at him. You need time. I can help buy it. How? Because Rowan wants me, specifically. If his people see me in this building, they'll focus here instead of sweeping the perimeter. She held his gaze. That's the calculation. You know it is. Damien looked at her with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and not allowing any of them to reach the surface. Then he turned to Reyes. Northeast exit. Can we get 2 people out clean? 60 seconds ago, yes. Now. Reyes studied the monitor. Maybe. They haven't fully closed the east side. Then we move in 60 seconds. He turned back to Elena. We both go. Northeast. Together. If they see us both move, they're going to see us regardless. His voice was controlled and absolute. I'm not leaving you here as bait. That's not a discussion. He looked at her in a way that foreclosed the argument without raising his voice. And Elena accepted it because there wasn't time not to, and because some part of her was aware that being argued for was a thing she hadn't had much practice with. Reyes pulled a side panel off the east wall to reveal a narrower door behind it. Damien grabbed the remaining document copies, everything that hadn't gone with Tomas, and handed half to Elena and took half himself. She still had the document box. She pressed it under her arm. When I say move, Reyes said, eyes on the monitor, you move and you don't stop. 10 seconds. The north side monitors showed figures moving toward the warehouse entrance. Not rushing. Disciplined, which was worse. Disciplined meant trained. Move. They went through the side door into a service corridor that smelled like old concrete and rust, and ran the length of the building's interior wall. Reyes went first, fast and low, and Elena followed and Damien behind her, and the sound of the main warehouse door being breached came through the walls as a low-impact sound, felt as much as heard, and Elena pressed the document box harder against her ribs and ran. The corridor ended at a fire door. Reyes hit the bar, and the door opened into an alley. Cold air, darkness, the smell of the bay. And they were out and moving east before the door finished swinging. Behind them, voices. A shout. Not close enough. The alley ran between the warehouse and the building adjacent, narrow, and Reyes moved through it without hesitation, which told Elena she had walked it before, which told Elena that Damien's people were exactly as prepared as he had implied. At the alley's end, a street, quiet. A delivery truck parked far enough away not to block sight lines. Reyes turned north, 50 meters. Another turn. And then they were on Ferris, and the commercial lot was visible, and the gray hatchback was in Lot B, and Reyes had it unlocked and running before Elena had fully processed that they had made it out. Tomas was already there, Ren, Nora in the back seat with Archive 4 on her lap. They split into two cars. Reyes driving the first with Tomas and Ren. Damien driving the second. Elena, Nora, the boxes. He drove without the GPS from memory, the route changing twice as Reyes relayed position updates from the warehouse. Elena sat in the front passenger seat and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed with the detached interest of someone cataloging a fact. Not fear, exactly. The body's receipt for the last several hours. They'll search the warehouse, Damien said. He was driving with both hands, eyes moving between the road and the mirrors in a rhythm. They won't find anything useful, Elena said. Everything is with us or submitted. They'll know we filed. Yes. Then Rowan will know by morning what we've done. Good. She looked out the windshield at the city going gray with the first suggestion of dawn at the edges of the sky. Let him know. Damien glanced at her. She didn't look back. She was watching the horizon. The shareholders' meeting, she said. What about it? Ashcroft Capital Holdings has an emergency shareholders' meeting scheduled. I saw it in the financial documents. Standard notice, required by charter anytime there's a change in managing director status. She looked at him. Marcus's appointment becomes official at the meeting, which is when? 2 days. The city opened up around them, and in the back seat Nora held the archive box and kept her eyes forward, and Elena felt the weight of everything the night had cost settling into her joints, her hands, the back of her skull. 2 days. The OPC filing was in. The evidence was distributed. Crane was a witness. Mene was exposed. The trust instrument had a memo that neutralized it in 48 hours with the right attorney. All of it pointed to one place, one room, one moment where everything that had been built in silence over 22 years would either stand or collapse in front of everyone who needed to see it. The shareholders' meeting. I need to be in that room, Elena said. Rowan will block your access. He'll try. She turned to look at Damien. Can you get me in the building? He was quiet for 2 seconds. 3. The particular silence of someone running a calculation that requires absolute honesty about what they can and cannot do. Yes, he said. Then that's where this ends, Elena said. Dawn was coming up over Harrow Bay, cold and clear and without sentimentality, the way dawn comes when the night has been the kind of night that has burned through everything unnecessary and left only the shape of what remains. Elena Ashcroft sat in a moving car with her father's ring against her chest, and 2 days in front of her and the name of her uncle's company filed in a federal complaint that was already, at this moment, sitting in an intake queue that Rowan Ashcroft had no access to and no way to close. She was not the woman who had straightened her place card at the wrong end of a table. She was not the woman who had driven 2 hours in traffic to be publicly reminded of her father's supposed failures. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she was, but she knew what she was going to do in 2 days, in a boardroom full of lawyers and executives and investors who had watched Rowan Ashcroft build something on stolen ground and said nothing. And she knew she was going to walk into that room with nothing but the truth and a worn silver ring and the 22 years of her father's patience behind her like a wall. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Marcus. She let it ring twice. 3 times. Damien glanced at her. She answered. The filing, Marcus said. His voice was stripped of everything except urgency. You actually filed? Yes. Elena, do you understand what you've started? Rowan he's not just going to let this. I know. He's calling in people, not just lawyers, people. The kind that Marcus's voice broke slightly and reformed. He's going to try to block you from the shareholders' meeting, and if he can't do that, he's going to make sure you never get to say anything in that room that anyone will be able to use afterward. And I don't... A breath, rough. I don't know how to stop him from doing that. Elena was quiet for a moment. The car moved through the new pale light of early morning. Then don't try to stop him, Marcus. What? Just make sure you're in the room, she said. 2 days. Be in that room. That's all I'm asking. Silence on his end. She could hear him breathing, the specific breathing of someone who has been avoiding a decision for a long time and can feel the last of the space to avoid it closing. And if I am, he said slowly, what happens? The truth happens, Elena said. What you do with it is up to you. She ended the call. Outside the window, Harrow Bay caught the first flat light of morning and threw it back silver and cold, and somewhere across the water the Ashcroft estate sat in its own illumination, waterfront and glass and the weight of what it had been built on. And Elena watched it until the road curved and it disappeared, and she turned back to the windshield, and the 2 days were not quiet. They were the particular kind of not quiet that looks like stillness from the outside. No explosions, no confrontations in parking structures, no phones ringing at 4 in the morning, but underneath ran a constant current of movement, of preparation, of the kind of work that doesn't make noise but costs everything anyway. Thomas spent 31 hours straight on the trust instrument memorandum, cross-referencing Crane's filing instructions against the original trust language until he could articulate, in the flat, precise vocabulary of a legal brief, exactly how Elena's claim satisfied every conditional clause and why Crane's conflict of interest voided his oversight authority retroactively. He did this on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee and the focused stubbornness of a man who understood that what he was building had to be airtight. Not because the truth wasn't sufficient, but because the people on the other side had spent 20 years learning how to make sufficient truths disappear on procedural grounds. Reyes ran surveillance on the Ashcroft Capital Holdings building, a 40-story tower in the financial district called Ashcroft Tower in the way that men like Rowan name things after themselves before the ground is fully settled beneath them. She mapped the entry points, the security configurations, the elevator systems, the boardroom floor, which was 38, and the specific habits of the building's management team, who arrived at 7 and left the front desk understaffed between 7:30 and 8. Wren rebuilt the documentary timeline into a presentation format that could be projected in a boardroom, 43 slides, every claim sourced to a specific document with an exhibit number, the whole thing structured so that a person with no prior knowledge of the Ashcroft family's finances could follow it from beginning to end and arrive at only one possible conclusion. Nora wrote a sworn statement, 4 pages, handwritten first and then typed by Wren, covering everything she had witnessed and held for 11 years, signed and dated and notarized by a contact of Tomas's who asked no questions. Philip Crane, from wherever he had gone after the parking structure, sent a signed affidavit by secure courier on the morning of the second day. It covered the trust instrument, his role in the shell company structure, and 3 specific instances in which Rowan had directly instructed him to take actions that constituted fraud. He did not editorialize. He stated facts and signed his name, and Elena read it twice and said it with the other materials and didn't say anything about what it cost her to accept help from a man who had spent 20 years helping the wrong person. Daniel Crane was released, quietly, without acknowledgement from Rowan's side, on the afternoon of the first day, approximately 6 hours after the OPC filing acknowledgement went out. He called his father and then apparently spent the rest of the day in a hotel room in Portland, and Tomas confirmed through channels Elena didn't ask about that he was unharmed. Damien made calls. She didn't know the full shape of what those calls accomplished. She knew he had people inside the building's security company who owed him something, knew he had arranged for a specific elevator to be operational at a specific time, knew that 2 of the shareholders who held significant minority positions in Ashcroft Capital Holdings had received, through untraceable intermediaries, a preview of certain financial documents that had caused them to reach out to their own attorneys, whose presence at the meeting was now confirmed. She knew these things because Reyes briefed her at 6 in the morning on the second day, sitting at a new table in a new location, a rented office space, clean, anonymous, 2 miles from Ashcroft Tower, with a coffee she was too tired to drink. She did not know everything Damien did to make those 2 days work. She had decided she could live with not knowing. What she knew was her father's ring on a chain around her neck, and the weight of the document box in her hands when she picked it up, and the way the light fell on the east wall of the rented office at dawn on the second day, cold and direct and without illusion. She called Marcus once, the evening before the meeting. He answered on the second ring. "Are you coming?" she said. A long pause. "Yes." "Are you bringing your father's lawyers?" "They'll be there regardless." Another pause. "I'm not bringing them. I'm just coming." She almost said something. Several things presented themselves. Things about how long she had waited to hear him say something honest. Things about the years of summers and school breaks, and the particular loneliness of being the cousin who was tolerated rather than wanted. Things about her father and what Marcus had known, and when. She let all of them go. "I'll see you there," she said, and ended it. She slept for 4 hours. Not well, not badly. She dreamed about her father's handwriting, the horizontal bar through his 7s, which was not quite a nightmare and not quite a comfort, and was just, specifically, the truth of a person she missed. She woke at 5:30 and showered and dressed in the clothes she had bought the previous afternoon because she was not going to walk into a boardroom in a dinner party outfit that smelled like a parking structure and 2 consecutive all-nighters. She bought a black jacket and gray trousers and flat shoes that she could move in, and she stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the rented office's small washroom and looked at herself for a moment. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently put it down and hadn't yet adjusted to the absence of the weight. She looked, she thought, like her father. Around the jaw, around the eyes. She had always known it in an abstract way and had never particularly wanted to examine it and was not going to examine it now. She put the ring around her neck and went back to the main room. Damien was already there. He had shaved, which made him look slightly different, slightly more deliberate. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. The team moved at 7:15. Reyes, Tomas, and Ren went first, arriving as representatives of a financial consulting firm that did not exist, but had a registered address and a website that Ren had built in 48 hours, their documentation identifying them as advisors to a minority shareholder group. Nora went separately, with the sworn statement in a sealed envelope, and Tomas's briefing on exactly where to sit and exactly what to do with the envelope and when. Elena and Damien went last. They took a car to a building 3 blocks from Ashcroft Tower and walked the rest of the way through the early morning foot traffic of the financial district. People with coffee, people with phones, people with the compressed, purposeful energy of a city in its working hours. And nobody looked twice at them, which was exactly what the morning required. Ashcroft Tower had glass doors and a lobby with marble floors and a security desk that at 7:44 in the morning was staffed by one person while the second position was, as Reyes had confirmed, briefly unmanned for a rotation break. Damien led her to the elevator bank on the left side of the lobby, the one that went directly to floors 30 through 40 without stopping, and they rode up in silence to 38. The boardroom was at the end of a corridor that smelled like carpet cleaner and recirculated air and the particular institutional scent of a building that had been making decisions for decades. Through the glass wall of the corridor, she could see the room was already occupied. Attorneys around the perimeter, a cluster of executives near the windows. Several people she didn't recognize who had the specific bearing of people who were there to observe rather than participate, which she guessed were the minority shareholders whose attorneys had made arrangements. And at the head of the table, already seated, already organizing the morning in the way that men who have run rooms for 20 years organize rooms. Rowan Ashcroft. He looked up when Elena walked through the door. The room did not fall silent immediately, the way rooms do in simplified versions of moments like this. It kept going for a few seconds. A conversation by the window, someone's phone, the scraping of a chair. And then, as people registered what they were looking at, it quieted in stages. The way silence actually arrives, unevenly, until it was complete. Rowan's expression did not change. That was the thing about men like Rowan. They had practiced their faces for so long that even genuine shock arrived looking like controlled assessment. He looked at her, then at Damien behind her, and his hands, which were on the table in front of him, did not move. "Elena," he said. "Uncle Rowan." She pulled out a chair on the left side of the table, near the middle, not at the far end. Not at the head. The middle, where she could see everyone and be seen. She sat down and set the document box on the table in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. Damien took the chair beside her without being invited and without any indication that he expected to be. Rowan's chief attorney, a man Elena didn't know but who had the groomed efficiency of someone billing $800 an hour, leaned toward Rowan and said something quietly. Rowan shook his head almost imperceptibly. "This is a shareholders' meeting," Rowan said. "You're not a shareholder." "I'm a creditor," Elena said, "and the named beneficiary of a trust instrument administered through this company's legal counsel." She looked at the attorney. "That gives me standing to be present at any meeting where the trust assets are materially affected. I believe your own charter confirms that." She looked back at Rowan. "Your attorney can verify it if you'd like." The attorney was already looking at something on his tablet. The door opened. Marcus came in. He was wearing a dark suit and he looked like he hadn't slept well, which was the most honest thing about him in the room. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. He sat down on the right side of the table, 3 seats from Rowan, and did not look at his father. Rowan noticed. His eyes moved from Marcus to Elena and back with the calibrated attention of a man recalculating. "We can begin," Elena said. "This meeting has an agenda," Rowan said. His voice had steadied into the register he used for rooms he ran. "The appointment of Marcus Ashcroft as managing director of Ashcroft Capital Holdings. That is the agenda." "I'd like to add an item," Elena said. "You can't add items. You're not a shareholder." "She doesn't need to be." One of the people Elena hadn't recognized spoke from the far end of the table. A woman in her 50s, precise, with the measured authority of someone who had learned to speak in rooms like this without being interrupted. "I'm representing a minority shareholder group holding combined 14.3%. We'd like to hear from Miss Ashcroft before the directorship vote proceeds." She looked at Rowan. "The charter requires a majority vote to proceed. You don't have it yet." Rowan looked at her with the specific expression of a man encountering a wall he built to be in a different place. "Mr. Viscari," Rowan said, looking at Damien, "has no standing here whatsoever. His presence is—" "He's my advisor," Elena said. "He's a criminal." "He's never been charged with anything." Elena's voice was even. "Which is more than I can say for the people who are about to be." The room went very still. Elena opened the document box. She didn't do it dramatically. She opened it the way her father had probably organized it. Practically, purposefully, without performance. She set the materials on the table in front of her in the order Tomas had arranged them. The financial records first, then the shell company chart, then the correspondence. "In 1999, she said, Ashcroft Capital Holdings transferred $47 million in family estate assets into a series of shell corporations. The transfer was structured to appear as a legitimate portfolio reallocation. It was not. She slid the top document to the center of the table. The beneficial ownership of those shell corporations traces, through 4 layers of holding structure, to Rowan Ashcroft and 2 named associates. Rowan's attorney was on his feet. I'm going to have to object to this entire— You can object after she finishes. The minority shareholders' representative said it without raising her voice, and the attorney sat down, which told Elena that the woman's clients held something that mattered. Elena continued. She went through it in the order Wren had built it. The asset diversion, the trust instrument, the sustained misdirection that had kept the fraud invisible for 2 decades. She spoke in the flat, factual register that Tomas had coached her on, because facts delivered without emotion were harder to dismiss than facts delivered with it. And she had spent 2 days practicing the discipline of it, even when the facts themselves were not flat or factual things inside her body. She was on the 3rd document set when Rowan said, "These are forgeries." "They're originals," she said. "The copies in the Meridian Vault are available for comparison. The originals have been verified by an independent document examiner." She slid a short report across the table. Chain of custody is documented. Your source for these documents is a career criminal. My source is my father, she said. And something in her voice changed with those words, not dramatically, not a break, but a shift in weight. The shift of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally allowed to set it down in the right place. Gavin Ashcroft spent 8 years documenting what you did. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it because he wanted this room or this building or any part of what you built on what you took from him. He did it because he wanted the truth to exist somewhere, even if he never saw it used. She paused. I'm using it. Rowan looked at her across the table. His face was still controlled. His hands on the table were still. But his eyes had changed. The calculation in them had shifted to something that was older and more private. The look of a man who has just understood that the ground he built everything on has been, this whole time, already moving. You have no idea, he said, what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. Elena held his gaze. The same thing he did. I'm just doing it where people can see. She reached into the box and placed the many correspondence on the table. The room responded to it before anyone had read it. Something in the way Elena placed it, the deliberateness, the specific weight of a document set that was different from the others. The minority shareholders' representative leaned forward. 2 of the executives near the window exchanged a look. Rowan's attorney, who had begun to relax slightly, went still again. Judge Carla Mene, Elena said, 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. This correspondence documents her interference in 2 separate back-channel reports that my father attempted to file in 2003 and 2005. The interference was arranged by Rowan Ashcroft. She looked at the room. This correspondence was submitted to the Office of Professional Conduct for the 9th Circuit 48 hours ago. The intake has been confirmed. The review process is active. The silence was total. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. Rowan's attorney gathered his materials with the sudden purposeful energy of a man whose calculation of personal exposure has just changed significantly, and Marcus, from his seat 3 chairs down from his father, exhaled. A single long breath that was the sound of something finally, irrevocably over. Rowan looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. This meeting, Rowan said, and his voice had changed, still controlled, but the quality of the control had changed, had become the control of someone managing a collapse rather than running a room, is adjourned. It isn't, the minority shareholders' representative said. She stood up. I move that the directorship vote be postponed pending full shareholder review of the materials presented. I'd like a second. Seconded. One of the other observers, a man Elena hadn't been able to place, who had been sitting with quiet attention for the entire presentation, said it clearly and without hesitation. He looked at Elena when he said it, a brief direct look that was not exactly recognition, but was something adjacent to it, the look of someone who has waited a long time for a specific thing to happen and has just seen it happen. Rowan stood up. He stood up, The way large men stand up in rooms they built, the full authority of it, the physical weight of decades of occupying space and expecting space to accommodate him. He looked at Elena, and he looked at Damien, and he looked at the documents on the table. And something moved through his face that she had never seen there before in 30 years of knowing him. Not guilt. She didn't think Rowan Ashcroft was capable of guilt in any conventional sense. But something, the recognition, maybe, of a specific kind of defeat. The kind that comes not from being outmatched, but from being outweighted, which was worse. Which was the kind that meant the other person had been right about something fundamental that you had always dismissed. He walked out of the boardroom without speaking. His attorney followed 30 seconds later, already on his phone. The room held its breath for a moment. Then the minority shareholders' representative began speaking quietly to her associate, and the executives near the window began the low, urgent conversations of people managing exposure. And Wren, from her position as a financial consultant near the room's perimeter, caught Elena's eye and gave a small, precise nod that meant, "The recording is running. Everything said in this room from this point forward is documented." Marcus got up and came around the table. He stopped in front of Elena and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was enough history between them to fill the room twice over, and not enough of it was good. "The recording you have," he said quietly, "from 2003. I'm on it. I know. I was 23. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. He looked older than he had at the dinner 2 nights ago, which was a short time for a face to change, but some nights compress time differently. "What happens to me?" Elena looked at him. She thought about the phone call in the car, his voice stripped of everything except urgency. He's going to make sure you never get to say anything in that room. She thought about him sitting 3 chairs down from his father and saying nothing and seconding nothing and just being present, which was what she had asked for. "That depends on what you do next," she said. He nodded. It was not a relieved nod. It was the nod of someone who understands they are going to have to earn something and is not sure they know how and is going to have to try anyway. He went back to his chair. Elena sat for a moment longer and looked at the documents on the table. Her father's handwriting on the Shell Company chart, the carbon of 22 years of careful, quiet, costly work spread across a boardroom table in the building that had been built on top of it. She picked up the ring from the chain around her neck and held it in her palm. Then she put it back. Not yet. The legal process that followed was not fast and was not clean and was not the kind of thing that resolved in a single clean moment. It was paperwork and depositions and attorneys and counterfilings and the grinding institutional work of a case that involved multiple jurisdictions and a sitting federal judge and 20 years of financial documentation that had to be verified, cross-referenced, authenticated, and argued over in rooms that smelled like conference coffee and professional anxiety. It took 11 months. In that 11 months, Rowan Ashcroft was indicted on 7 counts of financial fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of obstruction of justice related to the suppression of Gavin's 2003 back-channel report. Philip Crane cooperated fully with federal investigators, his testimony providing the critical link between Rowan's instructions and the Shell Company transfers, and received a reduced sentence in exchange. Judge Carla Mene resigned from the Ninth Circuit within 3 weeks of the OPC filing and faced a separate federal investigation that moved, as federal investigations do, with the particular pace of an institution that prefers thoroughness to speed. Marcus was interviewed twice. He was not charged. He resigned from Ashcroft Capital Holdings on his own initiative 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting, before anyone asked him to, and the resignation letter he sent to the board was 1 paragraph and said nothing except that he was stepping down to allow the company to address its governance issues without the complication of his continued presence. Elena read it when Tomas forwarded it to her and thought it was the most honest document Marcus had ever produced. The Meridian Trust was dissolved on month 4, its conditions satisfied by Thomas's legal memorandum and Crane's cooperation, and the assets it controlled, which, with 20 years of compounded value, had grown to something significantly more than the original $47 million, were transferred to Elena's control under a court-administered order that took 48 hours to execute and 3 months of preliminary work to make possible. She did not celebrate the transfer. She was sitting in her apartment when the confirmation came through. The apartment with the paint smell and the old radiators, which she had not left and had not had any particular desire to leave, because it was hers in a way that had nothing to do with what it was worth. She read the confirmation on her laptop, and then she closed the laptop and sat for a while in the quiet, listening to the city outside and the radiator ticking. She thought about her father in the storage unit, with the filing cabinets and the folding chair and the single overhead fluorescent, building something he knew might outlive him. She thought about the letter. I chose patience. I chose you. She made 2 phone calls. The first was to Nora, who answered on the third ring from what sounded like a different city. She had finally left Harrow, moved to the coast somewhere, she mentioned, somewhere with actual water and fewer people who knew her face. She sounded lighter. Not happy exactly, but lighter. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential and everything that was. And when Elena hung up, she sat with the warmth of it for a moment, the warmth of being known by someone who had known her father, which was its own specific kind of company. The second call was to an architect she had found through a referral from a colleague, a woman who specialized in adaptive reuse of commercial properties, which was the correct professional framing for what Elena had in mind. She had been thinking about it for weeks, had sketched it out on paper in the margins of other documents late at night, the broad shape of it, scholarships for trade programs, grants for families of workers who had died without pension or protection, a foundation structured around the specific needs of people whose labor built things they would never own. Not a monument, not a dynasty. Something functional and continuous and named, if it was named at all, not after an Ashcroft, but after the kind of work her father had done and the kind of life he had lived. She met with the architect the following week. The foundation took another 4 months to structure properly, with Tomas's help, and by the time its first grants were awarded, the Ashcroft legal proceedings were in their final phase, and Rowan was awaiting sentencing, and the tower in the financial district had a new interim board and a new name that nobody had quite settled on yet. She visited her father's grave on the first anniversary of the boardroom meeting. It was a gray morning, the kind that doesn't decide between rain and no rain, and the cemetery was quiet in the way cemeteries are quiet, which is its own kind of full. The headstone was simple. She had arranged for a new one after the proceedings, replacing the original small marker that she had always thought was inadequate, but hadn't had the resources to change. His name, his dates, and below them a single line that she had spent 3 days choosing and had ultimately taken from his own letter because nothing she could write was more accurate. He chose patience. He chose right. She stood at the headstone for a while without speaking, which felt correct. Her father had not been a man for speeches. She took the ring from the chain around her neck. She looked at it for a long time. The worn silver, the engraving soft with years. Her father's name in the inside of the band, legible still, always legible. She thought about putting it down, leaving it there. It passed through her as a thought, and she held it long enough to know it wasn't right. The ring wasn't a thing to leave behind. It was a thing to carry forward, and there was a difference, and her father had understood the difference, which was why he had kept it until the moment it needed to become something else. She put it back on the chain and around her neck and stood for another minute in the gray morning. Then she left. Damien Vescari came to find her 2 weeks after that, which was longer than she had expected and shorter than she had feared. He appeared at the door of her apartment at 7 in the evening, with the particular quality of someone who has decided something and has come to deliver the decision rather than discuss it. She let him in. He looked at the apartment, the paint smell, the books, the desk with its organized papers, and she could see him cataloging it the way he cataloged everything, with the focused inventory of someone who pays attention to spaces as a way of understanding the people who live in them. "You didn't move," he said. "I didn't want to move." He nodded. He stood in the middle of her living room with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the same dark, steady attention he had brought to every conversation since the night of the dinner, and she looked back at him and waited. "I've settled the last of what I owed him," Damien said. "I know. Which means I don't have an obligation here anymore." He said it plainly, without prelude. "And I wanted to be honest with you about that. I appreciate that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, which was exist without particular regard for what was happening inside any specific apartment within it. "I'm also—" He stopped. started differently. There are things I did during the 11 months to protect the case, to keep Rowan's people away from you and from the process. He looked at her steadily. Not all of it was clean. I know that too. And he searched for the right word, which was unusual for him. I'm not naive about what you are, she said. I've never been naive about it. She paused. I'm also not going to pretend the last 11 months didn't happen, or that I don't know what it cost you to be inside it. She looked at him. What do you want, Damien? He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the radiator. I don't entirely know, he said finally. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say, which made it, in its way, the most significant. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Do you want coffee? Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, the possibility of one. Yes, he said. She went to the kitchen and he followed, and she made coffee in the small kitchen with the window that looked out on the back alley and the street beyond it. And they sat at the kitchen table where there was not quite room for two, and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with Rowan Ashcroft or Gavin's vault or the 11 months. And it was not easy exactly, because nothing between them had ever been easy, but it was present, in a way, specific to this kitchen and this evening and these two people who had arrived here from very different directions. He left at 9. He said goodnight at the door, and she said goodnight, and neither of them made any particular promises, because people who have been through the kind of thing they had been through tend to be careful about promises, and careful about the future, and more honest about the uncertainty of both. She closed the door and stood in her apartment in the quiet. She thought about all the things the night of the dinner had been. The place card, slightly crooked, that she had straightened herself. The ring placed in her trembling hand by a man who had been keeping a promise for 22 years. The sound of Rowan's laughter from the head of the table, careless and absolute, the laughter of a man who had forgotten there was anything to account for. She thought about her father, not the way she had thought about him in the months of proceedings, as a case, as a set of documents, as the subject of a legal argument, but as a person. The squint in the photograph, the horizontal bar through his sevens, the specific texture of being his daughter, which had never meant ease or wealth or the right seat at the table, but had meant, if she was honest with herself in the specific way that honesty requires time and quiet and the absence of crisis, something she had not had words for until recently. It had meant being seen by him, fully and without condition. Which was not nothing, which was, in the economy of what people actually needed from one another, nearly everything. She went to her desk and sat down and opened the folder for the Foundation's second round of grant awards, which was due for review in 3 days, and she looked at the applications, people with the specific needs of people who had been doing necessary work for a long time and had not been seen for it. And she started reading. The city moved outside the window. The radiator ticked. The ring rested against her chest, warm from her body, its worn silver holding the name of a man who had spent his life choosing the harder thing because it was the right thing, who had built something in secret because the time had not been right for it to be seen, who had trusted that the time would come and been right. Somewhere across the city, in a cemetery with a new headstone and a gray autumn sky above it, the grass was settling over a grave that now had the right name on it, a name the city had called worthless and history would call something else. And in a small apartment that smelled like paint and old radiators, his daughter sat at her desk in the good light and did the work that was in front of her. And outside the window the city went on, and the night came down, and the ring was warm, and the debt was paid, and the truth, which had waited 22 years for exactly this, finally rested in the open air where it belonged.